So I finally read all of Chainsaw Man, and wow, what a pleasant surprise this series is, or at least I should say part one. First of all, let me just say that I'm extremely surprised that this was published in Weekly Shonen Jump, because this is by far the most extreme Jump series I've ever read, and I think there ever has been. I really don't know how Fujimoto was able to pull this off. There seems to be little to no censoring in this series, aside from explicit, straight up X-rated stuff. But this really pushed the envelope. And with that being said, it's so refreshing to read this because, in itself, it's not really a shonen. And I know that shonen isn't a genre. It's intended for a demographic. This is more of a seinen than most senens. This is just straight YA material through and through. And not just because of the violence and the adult themes and situations, but more so just the themes of it. This explores existentialism, individualism, and hedonism on levels that for sure teenagers won't really understand yet. I mean, they'll get a kick out of it for sure. I mean, how can you not? But Fujimoto really explores these themes in this series. And I think it also speaks to a lot of who he is as a person and what he ultimately sees life as. But anyway, like I was saying, so refreshing to read a battle manga like this that isn't afraid to go places, isn't afraid to explore a character's sexual side or them being interested in other people and them truly saying what's on their mind and acting somewhat realistic, not having these canned responses and reactions to certain things or having this shoehorned in fabricated sense of morality. It's no, this series is not about that at all. At the core of it, Denji is a good person, but also at the same time, he's very much not. He's very selfish and super hedonistic, but I think that also makes him very realistic and somewhat relatable. I mean, obviously not all of us are like him, or at least I hope that most of you are. And I mean, I'm sure you crave a lot of the things that he does, especially if you're younger, but he's not really necessarily someone that we're supposed to relate to completely, but more so somebody that we're supposed to understand and eventually root for. But speaking of rooting for these characters, that's another thing that I found surprising with this series, because I'll admit it took me a couple times to get into this series. I read the first 10 chapters at least 3 or 4 times before I finally got past them, because the beginning of this is kind of slow in my opinion, simply because the story wasn't gripping me that hard and the characters weren't really likable. None of them. I couldn't really get on board with Denji at first because I didn't like what he was about. I didn't like how he was. I can't really relate to how he is in the beginning of the series. And all of the other characters are just despicable or just cold and just unrelatable or unlikable. But once I got past the 10 chapter threshold and we started to get into the Eternity Devil arc, that's when the series really opened up for me and I was oh wait, this is actually really good. And then from that point on, it gets better and better and better, and all of the characters really mature in a great way in surprisingly a really short time, because as I'm sure most of you know, this series is only 97 chapters long, but you get such a rich story in that amount of time and such great character progression and arcs and development, more so than series that have over 300 chapters actually. And it's just so satisfying to read this because you see characters progress in a natural way and they just become better and better and get to the point of where you really like these characters and you don't want to see anything happen to them, but then the series goes to where, yeah, no one is safe and pretty much everyone is going to die, even more so than Demon Slayer. But anyway, as for the power system of it, I think it's really cool too, and I like the way that it works, the existence of the devils and whatnot, and how certain individuals can make contracts with them and gain their abilities, but at a certain price, of course. And then it comes down to oh, this person has contracts with this devil, or they have multiple contracts with multiple devils, and then they're able to manipulate their powers accordingly. And then also you have certain characters that are secretly devils themselves, and then it's revealed that oh, this person was that devil the whole time, and then it's they do something to transform into them, similar to how Denji revs the cord from his chest. And as for the fighting, it's pretty good. You're not going to get Jujutsu Kaisen or My Hero Academia-esque fight scenes because it's obviously not that type of manga and it's not that type of battle system, but for what it is, it's pretty cool and pretty ruthless as well. A lot of it is just Denji or another devil hacking up people, a lot of blood, a lot of viscera, guts and everything. But aside from that, just the action sequences, the choreography, very good. The art is very good as well. Fujimoto never really gets too sloppy or lazy with it, and the big panels where he needs to make a big impression, he nails them. There's some just individual panels from this series that are fantastic and pretty iconic already, despite only being around for a couple years. But aside from that, every arc seems to flow very well, and they all have satisfying conclusions to them and tie into each other. And it all just works for me, to be honest. Like, I just really enjoyed the flow of this. It's very easy to read and get through. It's not difficult at all. Like I said, the power system is pretty straightforward. It's like, this devil represents this sphere, and they have this certain ability, but the more that humanity has of a certain sphere, the stronger the devil will be. This is kind of like a thing in Japan, I guess, right? Because I've seen multiple series that have this same kind of dynamic to it, where like an evil spirit can manifest just from humanity or Japan having like the fear of it, which like wills it into existence. Like, I've seen this in Mob Psycho and Jujutsu Kaisen, so I assume it's like a Japanese folklore thing maybe, but still pretty cool nonetheless. But I really like the way that Fujimoto makes use of it here, especially just turning it into like a power system. And the way that it ultimately wraps up is pretty good as well. It's really hard to end these series, and I say end like this because it's technically not over. Like, when you come to the end of it, you'll see that it's like part 1 is over, and then obviously part 2 has begun. But just the part 1 ending, very good, very satisfying. The big twist is good as well. The main villain's very understandable in their motives, what they ultimately want, and how they achieve it. And that being said, the writing seems pretty structured. Like, you can go all the way back to the beginning and it ties into the very end. Like, it totally makes sense. It doesn't seem like Fujimoto was like writing this on the fly. Like, he had everything planned out, and it definitely shows. And I really appreciate that in these stories. Let me just go over all of the arcs real quick and give my thoughts on them. So the intro arc is kind of slow. I mean, it's not bad or anything, but it didn't pull me in so much as to where I was like really invested and I wanted to keep going. Like I said, it took me like 3 tries to finally get past the Bat Devil arc, because we'll go into that, and that arc is fine too, but man, it's really hard to get on board with these characters because a lot of them are just so unlikable at this point, in my opinion. But once you get past this and you get into the Eternity Devil arc, I love the way that Fujimoto crafted this. This might be my favorite arc in the series, actually. When you get all of these characters trapped into one room and then they have to figure out how to get out of it, but it's also bonding them at the same time, and this is where the characters start to become likable. And then you eventually get into the ending sequence of how Denji ultimately takes care of the Eternity Devil. It's just really fun, very well done. Then we get into the Katana Man arc, and this is where, you know, the standard battle manga tropes start coming in. Like, there's like the other mans in there. Like, there's other people like Denji where they have like a devil heart in them and they can transform as well. This was good as well, and I like the way that it expands the series. And then expanding on that, we go into the Bomb Girl arc, where we get the Bomb Devil, which starts off as a love interest for Denji, and I really like the way that this flows, and it ultimately goes into like this big long fight sequence between the Bomb Devil and pretty much everyone else. And man, this was just so good. Like, reading this back to back was just so much fun. Like, this is one of the better, if not the straight up best fight sequence in the series, possibly. Then we get the International Assassins arc, and this was a lot of fun, and it's really cool the way that Fujimoto put this together. It's a very interesting concept. I mean, it's nothing new, he's not reinventing the wheel, but the way that it's broadcasted to the world of that Denji is out there, and then all of the contracts are put on him, and then we get like all the world's best assassins to come together in one place, and he doesn't really stretch this out. We get to the point here, and I like it. Like, I feel like if other mangakas would have tried to do this arc, it would have taken much longer. But I just like the way that he gets to the point. It's like, hey, here are these cool characters, they're interesting, and now they're here, and now we're just going at it, and there's just chaos, and very fun. Like, this is a very fun arc. Them going to hell with the Darkest Devil and everything, just crazy. Like, one of the almost jumping the shark moments of the series, to be honest, but very good, and I like how it causes like this paradigm shift going forward. And this is kind of where like the depressing aspect of the series really comes in, because once we come into the Gun Devil arc, this is where characters start dying and things get really sad. And there's also a twist with the Gun Devil as well, and I like it. And it can be a little anticlimactic at first, but then once it ultimately plays out, you're like, wow, it makes sense because of the way that it was set up with the timelines with the Gun Devil and everything. And you know, the ultimate conclusion here with what happens to Aki and everything, very sad, but well done, because it's necessary. Like, we do need these aspects in the series sometimes, and I wasn't mad at this at all. I really do appreciate the way that Fujimoto took time to make this good, and it wasn't just rushed or kind of just put out there for shock factor. Like, everything matters here. And then we come into the final arc, the Control Devil arc, and once everything is ultimately revealed here, I was totally on board with it. Like, everything makes sense. I really like the twist, and I really like the way that it all ultimately plays out. Overall, I just really enjoyed this series. And if you haven't read it yet, you should probably read it, but also just check out the anime. So I just finished reading the entire Demon Slayer manga, so that means there's gonna be major spoilers in this video if you've only watched the anime. So in short, I enjoyed this manga. I thought it was pretty good. It's not like the best as the numbers would indicate it is, at least in Japan, but it's pretty solid. Like I talked about in my review for the first season of the anime, it's pretty derivative. It's not reinventing the wheel by any means. It's not even really like doing anything new. It's standard battle manga shonen, through and through. It's like very traditional and follows all of the same tropes and everything, but it just does them all very, very well. And I think that's why it's such a well-received series. And it's like a crazy phenomenon in Japan right now. And it makes sense to me because usually in like art and media and pop culture and stuff like that, those are usually the things that, rise to the top. But I really think the driving force behind this series' popularity is definitely the first season of the anime, because it's very well animated, storyboarded, and everything like that. But the manga, on the other hand, is kind of rough at points. The art is great, don't get me wrong, and some of the panels are amazing, but a lot of it is kind of sloppily made, in my opinion. And that's not an insult, it's just kind of a critique. Like, comparing it to the other mainstream series, some of the panels look kind of lazily drawn at points, and maybe that's the intention of Kyoharu here. But at points, I guess it was a little off-putting, but it's not really like that big of a deal. I mean, it's not like a series needs incredible art for it to be good, because it's definitely not the case. But like I said, just a little sloppy at times. But aside from the art, like the paneling and the choreography, that's pretty good. Sometimes it's a little messy, but not all series are perfect with that anyway. But I think this series does a pretty good job of getting the fights across. And speaking of the fights, they're pretty long. Like, one of the cool aspects of this series is that like when a fight happens, you're pretty much seeing the fight from start to finish. There's like not a lot of cutaways once a fight actually begins. Like in a lot of other series, like a big fight will happen or something, and then we're just watching it in pieces. Like a big moment will happen, then they'll cut away, and then we'll have a clash, and then they'll cut away to other stuff. A lot of the times in this series, you're just seeing the whole entire fight, and it'll take like 3 or 4 chapters or even longer than that of just a continuous fight that you're watching. And I noticed this like in the anime itself, like there's multiple episodes where you're just watching a full-blown fight, and there's no cutaways to like ancillary characters or storylines. And I like that. I think that's pretty cool. Now, another thing that we need to talk about is the crazy amounts of death in this series. It's unlike a lot of the other series that I follow or have followed before. It's unusual for this many characters to die in like a battle manga, especially like in the shonen demographic, at least in my opinion. So those of you who are always like, man, I wish the stakes were higher in these series and characters actually died, well, this is the series for you, because characters die a lot. And if they don't die, they are seriously maimed or injured. Like by the final chapter, I think only 3 of the original Hashira that we meet are alive. And it's bittersweet because the Hashira are obviously some of the coolest characters in this series, and they're kind of built up to be that way. Now, does the deaths take away from this series? I don't think so, but I also wouldn't necessarily say that it like strengthens it. I think it kind of rides like this ambivalent line, in my opinion. It's like, it's fine that it does this, and I think it's definitely unique in its way that no characters are safe pretty much, kind of like how Game of Thrones was. But after like the 3rd or 4th death, you're kind of like, ah man, I wish some of these characters maybe would have survived or something. And yes, it is comforting and whatnot, but at the same time, I don't think it's necessary that all of these characters needed to die, but I also don't think like they needed to live either. Like I said, it kind of strikes this weird ambivalent opinion in me. So as for the story and everything, it's very compact and it follows a straight line and does not fray away from it at all. Like other battle mangas and shonens and stuff like that, they'll have like a big overarching story the way that Demon Slayer does, but they'll take kind of a while to get to their end goal. As we're with Demon Slayer, there is none of that. It's just pretty much one full saga the whole entire time. And it's just basically Tanjiro trying to eventually defeat Muzan. That's it. That's like the whole story here. And like, while this is 205 chapters long, it feels kind of short and almost kind of rushed in a way, but not like egregiously or anything. I mean, it's like almost feels rushed. It just makes me wish there was more to this story, because not everyone is fleshed out and not everything is fully explained. Like, some of these arcs, I guess, are dragged on a little longer than what you would think they would be, and other characters suffer because they're not a part of those arcs. Like Nezuko, Zenitsu, Inosuke. While these characters are built up in the beginning of the anime, and then a little bit after that, there's like a whole portion in like the 3/5 of this series where they're just gone and we get no real development on them or anything like that. And then they're kind of just thrown in towards the end of this series, and then they're just given all of this rush development and motivations and things like that. Like Inosuke and Zenitsu, they're kind of just pushed up the power scale along with Tanjiro. Like, we see Tanjiro training and whatnot, but it's just like, hey, they were training too, and they're close to Tanjiro in power now, so that's fine. We don't really need to go into that. And then during their like last major significant fights that they have, their whole character arcs and story arcs and everything are kind of just crammed together and thrown out there, and it's like there wasn't really much build up to them. For Zenitsu, there was some breadcrumbs there and whatnot, but for Inosuke, it's kind of just an afterthought. And I feel like Kyohara almost was like forgot that Inosuke needed to have a major character arc and everything, so she kind of just shoehorned it in there at the end. And then for Nezuko, it's kind of like what I was talking about in my anime review. When she's not needed in the story, she just falls asleep. And in the very last arc of this, which is like, I don't know, over 60 chapters or something like this, she's gone until the very end because she's just not needed. But before the final arc even happens, the story kind of gets repetitive. Like after the Infinity Train arc, it's kind of like a rinse and repeat of Tanjiro recovering, training, becoming stronger, and then fighting one of the upper 12 Kizuki while teaming up with one of the Hashira. This happens quite a bit up until the final arc of the series. When we do get to the final arc, which happens like around, I don't know, 138 or something, like when Muzan encounters Ubuyashiki, the series is just at a full-blown 10 from that point on. Like, it was awesome reading the last stretch of chapters in this series because this final arc is very cathartic. I mean, everything was leading to this. That's why I said it's a very compact and straightforward story. Like, okay, we've set up, you know, the final 12 Kizuki, we set up the final Hashira, and we set up, you know, Muzan. So now they're all gonna come together, fight, and then we're gonna have the final battle with Muzan. And when we do get to the final battle with Muzan, I thought it delivered. I thought it was well done. I like how everybody worked together to ultimately take him down. It's not just Tanjiro with the power of friendship beating him in the end via Deus Ex or whatever. I think it's a well done battle. Everything made sense for the most part, aside from like the off-panel developments from Tamayo, who just had all of the answers to everything, which is understandable because, you know, Tanjiro did send her samples and stuff throughout the series with her ghost cat, so it's fine. But I really did like the long, drawn-out final battle with Muzan. I mean, everything in the series was headed towards that, so it's nice that it delivered. Then I even liked the weird little twist at the end where Tanjiro temporarily becomes the Demon King. That's very interesting, and that typically doesn't happen in series, especially at the very end. But like I said, yeah, great series, very compact. I wish it was a little longer. I wish more characters were expanded upon, and I wish Kyohara explained exactly what the Blue Spider Lily was, but maybe the sequel they will. But overall, I'm feeling like an 8 on this series. Definitely worth checking out. All right, so I finally read all of Hunter x Hunter, and a lot of you know why it took me so long, because I said that I would only read Hunter x Hunter if Togashi returned. And wouldn't you know it, Togashi returned. So I decided to hold up my end of the bargain. And in about 4 weeks, I read the entire manga and I watched the entire Madhouse anime as well. So overall, as a full series, start to finish, I will say that I liked it. And I think that it is good. But I don't think it's like the GOAT series. And that was one of the things that I had heard a lot coming into this, especially when I was requested it for so long. You know, claims of it being the best written battle manga ever, it being a masterpiece, and so on and so forth. And I understand why people would think that for sure. I mean, pretty much every portion of like the big battle mangas have that sentiment. I mean, go to any like known battle manga subreddit right now and just type in masterpiece into the search bar and you'll find somebody claiming that that series is a masterpiece. But for Hunter x Hunter, I can't agree with that. And I don't want to disappoint anyone here, but this series series didn't really hit me that hard. So before I get too critical with it, let me just focus on the positives. So overall, I do think this is a very well written series. Actually, one of the better written series I've read. It's pretty original, and some of the stories in these arcs are really unique and interesting. Very different from what you would see from a typical battle manga, even to this day. And that was one of the main things that really kept me on board with wanting to finish this series. And also for its time, like when it was first being released in Jump for like, you know, the first couple years, I have no doubt that this was considered cutting edge. I mean, if this was just released today, no one would really be none the wiser because it still holds up very well. You can easily see its influence on a lot of the series that have come after it. A lot of like the current big battle manga series, heavy Hunter x Hunter influences on it. I think it has really good characters too, and you know, pretty diverse as well. But there is a serious issue with all of them, and I'll get into that. But this series also really knows how to hit its big moments and execute them very well. Like the big iconic moments of this series are iconic for a reason because they're pretty great. And at times, I'll say, I really do appreciate when Togashi decides to fully explain things, although that quickly becomes a detriment. So let me just go into my criticisms at this point. So the explaining, there's just too much. There's too much exposition, too much dialogue. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of things being explained and necessary exposition and dialogue and everything like that, but there has to be some kind of balance. And I don't think Hunter x Hunter strikes that balance, especially in like the latter portion of the series, like after the Chimera Ant arc. Something happened with Togashi and he more so went in the direction of like a novelization rather than just a battle manga. And it was always kind of there, but it just progressively got more and more superfluous. And I also think that's the reason why Hunter x Hunter is mainly known for like 2 or 3 sequences, because before I had read it, and whenever I was suggested it, or whenever I just saw Hunter x Hunter come up in social media or on YouTube, or when it was being referenced in some way, it was usually because of Netero versus Meruem or Gon versus Pito. After going through the series, I totally get why that is. It's because those sequences are pretty much the peak of the series, and they're also the most accessible. And also being accessible kind of bothers me at the same time, because Togashi will go out of his way in this series, and I mean really go out of his way, to overly complicate and overly explain so many minute details and minute characters and their abilities, as well as like their inner monologues and their rationale and this endless litigation of hypothetical situations. But when it comes to the 2 big moments with Netero versus Meruem and Gon versus Pito, those sequences and the exposition attached to them kind of just plays out like a standard battle manga would, which I just think is strange, because why not make an expository feast out of them like you did with everything else? And I'm not saying that I don't understand those sequences. Like I said, they're the most accessible. They're simple to understand. But with Netero, on the other hand, and his Nen ability, it's still to this day kind of ambiguous. Like, you go to the wiki right now, and not even the wiki itself is entirely sure what's going on with his Guanyan Bodhisattva. And I really wouldn't be that nitpicky about it if it just wasn't for the fact that everything else gets, you know, an entire chapter dedicated to it being explained. But with that comes the bloating of these arcs. These arcs aren't, you know, too long. I mean, the Chimera Ant arc is 133 chapters, but that's, you know, by far the longest one. But a lot of these could probably be cut in half, or at least a quarter of them cut off, if it was just like a normal series and it had like a normal amount of exposition and dialogue, and it didn't needlessly go into explaining things that, you know, I at least think the average reader doesn't really care about. And I'm not just talking about characters' abilities, but like I said, the endless monologues of litigation and critical thinking of situations and what's going to happen, as well as like details that have nothing to really do with Nen or the series itself as a whole, where Togashi will just start explaining how auctions work, or trying to explain to you this card game that he created for Greed Island. And also, speaking of the endless monologues of litigation and running over scenarios and whatnot, that goes back to what I was talking about with the diversity of the characters. And yes, for the most part, they are, you know, pretty unique and they have their own individual personalities, but at the core of every single character in the series, they are all Togashi. Because once you essentially get past the surface of them, They all literally think the same exact way, and it's how Togashi thinks. And I get that a lot of these characters are hunters, they're the cream of the crop. So naturally they would be, astute individuals, or just simply Nen users in general, because, having a critical level of thinking is integral to a Nen battle. But it's not even them. It's just every single character. Random civilians, children, teenagers. Everyone eventually gets to the point of where they just start thinking like Togashi. And I really think it kind of bogs down the series, to be honest. So let me just quickly go over how I feel about all of the arcs real quick. So the Hunter exam arc is really strong, and I think that this is the most fun that you're ever going to have with this series. Not the most entertained, but the most fun, because Togashi doesn't really become unhinged until like this arc is over, to be honest. The Zoldyck family arc, it's 5 chapters. It was fine. Heaven's Arena arc, this is when Togashi goes full Togashi for here on out. It's only 20 chapters, but it like feels double bad. It's not bad, but it's just the beginning of that like creeping bloat that all of these arcs are going to have. York New City arc, the core of this arc is great. I really like the Phantom Troop and their dynamic in the series. I even like that they're currently a part of it. But there's so many unnecessary aspects of this arc that really bog it down. When it reaches its high points, they're awesome. And I think the conclusion of it is fantastic. But overall, it's just unnecessarily bloated. So then we have Greed Island, and I was really looking forward to this arc because, it's set up early on and you're like waiting for him to get there, and he has to go through everything in the previous arc to finally get a chance to do it. And then once he gets to Greed Island, it's, I don't know, kind of anticlimactic in my opinion, because it's slow and the whole card game aspect of it isn't that interesting. And the fact that Togashi like expects you to be interested in it because he himself is interested in it, I think plays it to a detriment. Now, just like in York New, there's great moments in it, and the ending is pretty satisfying as well, but it's kind of a slog to get through this one. But it's not bad or anything. So then we come to the Chimera Ant arc, and this is obviously the best arc of the series, also the peak of the series. It reaches a high that I don't think it ever will reach again. And like I said before, it's 133 chapters, and it definitely doesn't need to be that long. I love the whole aspect of how the Chimera Ants work and what eventually becomes of them and how it ultimately wraps up. I mean, the ending of this arc is magnificent. One of the best endings to an arc I've ever read, but getting there can be a slog at times. There's like 2/5 of this arc that could easily be cut out and it would be fine. So like I said, that was the peak of the series, and after this, at least in my opinion, I think it starts to decline. So the 13th Hunter Chairman election arc, this on paper seems very exciting, especially because we're, fully introduced to Jing here, Gon meets him and all that, and that's all fine, but everything going on with this election and Killua and his sister, brother, I don't even know what's going on with that, but it's just not as compelling as I thought it was going to be. I mean, that aspect isn't like the entire weak point of this arc, but the election itself, I think, is. I mean, I appreciate the ending of it, but man, just everything else just didn't really hit me. So then the Dark Continent Expedition arc, this was only 9 chapters, but I think it still suffers from the same thing that the post Chimera Ant arc Hunter x Hunter does, and it's that there's an awesome concept there, and there are aspects of it that are so exciting. Like the concept of the Dark Continent itself is so exciting and so cool, and the information that we get on it is awesome. But the way that they go about it, and the way that Togashi sets it up and how everybody has to talk about it just somehow becomes boring. And then we come to the current arc of the series, the Succession Contest arc. And I'm gonna be blunt with you guys. This is 42 chapters of pain. I can't say that this is bad because it's not. It's, good writing, and the core of it is great. The idea here with the princes and the succession game in itself, and them getting the guardian Nen beasts and how they work and how they develop their abilities, that's all super interesting stuff. But outside of that, there is too much going on here, too many characters, and it seemingly can just go on forever, right? I mean, it's 42 chapters here, but this feels like 142 chapters by the time you're done with it. And I'm sure that it was easier to go through this arc on a weekly basis, but reading these chapters back to back is truly a difficult task because they're nearly just novelizations. It's hardly even battle manga anymore. And if this has to do with Togashi's illness and his inability to draw, I get it. But maybe just, hand it off to an artist like many of the other battle mangas do. But I think think Togashi has too much pride for that. Or, you know, just go full-blown novelization, because it almost is. Now, if you enjoyed this arc and you think it's a masterpiece and you think I'm like an idiot, hey, that's fine, understandable. But this arc just wasn't for me. And if it was for you and you really enjoyed it, then I'm glad, because at least somebody is. And I see that Togashi has all of these ideas and these awesome, unique, complex stories in his mind that he wants to get out, but I just don't think he's going about it in the best way. But that's just me. I'm just some idiot on the internet. My opinion doesn't really matter, guys. I mean, if you love the Succession arc and just all of Hunter x Hunter, and you don't agree with any of the criticisms I have, that's fine. But just for me, the series just didn't hit me as hard as I thought it would. But like I said in the beginning, overall, I think it's a good series, and I did enjoy it, aside from the final arc here, and I will continue to make content on it as the new chapters release. But I'm also not gonna like pander to you guys or have this false hype about it. Like, I'm gonna be honest, you know, in saying that, like, if I feel something is boring or bogged down or superfluous, then I'm gonna say it. But yeah, those are my thoughts. If you're angry with me, let me know in the comments. So the Bleach anime is returning next month, and it's going to be covering the final arc of the series, which is the 1,000-Year Blood War, and it's like 208 chapters, so there's going to be like quite a few episodes. And with that being said, I'm going to be covering them on the channel, or at least I'd like to. Not really sure if there's going to be a simulcast yet, and if there is, then yeah, I could easily cover the episodes on the channel, but if not, then there might be an issue with that. But let's just hope for the best. But in preparation for the series coming back, I read all 686 chapters of the series, and I'll say overall, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was pretty good. Now, was it great? Was it like one of the best battle mangas I've ever read? Not necessarily. As good and enjoyable as it is, it does have a lot of issues as well. And I'll get into it, but first I just want to go over the good stuff. So first of all, this series is really accessible. The chapters flow very nicely. The art is very well done. And it's overall just pretty likable for the most part. I would say the strongest aspect of the series is probably the characters, which it has a lot of. And Kubo crafts them pretty well, which is also pretty impressive given how large the cast is. Not just the protagonists, but the antagonists as well. He gives most of them pretty good depth and more or less satisfying character arcs throughout. Although he kind of falls flat on like the big villains for some reason. Like Aizen and Yuabak are kind of shallow, but like I said, the characters are very likable. I would say a majority of them, to be honest, and I really like their interactions, dynamics, and relationships. I think that's a strong point in this series as well. It also has a pretty cool power system, like the Zanpakutos with the Shikais and the Bankais, Kido, the Hado, the Raietsu, as well as the analog stuff, like with the Hollow powers, the Fullbringer stuff, etc. It's all really fun and interesting. And also, that being said, this series is pretty easy, and I don't mean that in a bad way, in like a good way. Like I said, it's accessible and it never really gets too complicated, which I like because I enjoy accessibility, especially when it's brought to a balance. I also think it has a nice pacing too, especially like with just the chapters themselves. Like the chapters are really easy to read and they're very smooth. The dialogue never gets out of hand. I never felt like it was a slog to get through this. Even like the Lost Agent arc, I was fine with it. But yeah, overall, it's just enjoyable and it's easy to get through and it's fun. I mean, you really can't ask for much more other than it having better writing. And I guess that's where my criticism comes in, because the writing could be better a lot of the time. And I'm not gonna say that it's necessarily bad writing, but I'll just say that it's lackluster, because while it has like these great characters and they have great dynamics and these arcs have great ideas behind them and awesome foundations, a lot of the time they wind up just falling flat for some reason. It feels like Kubo just comes up with these great ideas and then kind of just tries to figure it out along the way. Like a lot of these arcs and stories kind of feel like he was just writing it as it went on. Like he didn't really have a lot of this stuff planned ahead of time. Like a lot of the resolutions are just anticlimactic, to be honest. And I guess that maybe plays into its overall accessibility. I guess just with the majority of the audience. I could see why a lot of hardcores would have issues with the way that the series is written. There's just so much stuff that happens that has no setup. It kind of just falls down to Kubo making antagonists just way too powerful and the protagonist just not powerful enough. That's where he just keeps putting himself into this hole where it's like there's no way they can get out of it without just some random Deus Ex happening. And it just happens so much, like consistently throughout the series up until the very end. And it just always left me just wanting more and feeling unsatisfied with how things wrap up. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are quite a few things that have good build up and are set up ahead of time and have great payoffs, and I really enjoy those moments. But just a lot of the huge moments kind of feel like Kubo was just figuring out as he was going along, and then sometimes, I don't know, he kind of just did something because maybe he was on a time crunch or something. I'm not really sure. But there's just a lot of stuff that happens in this series that's kind of just like, oh, we have a problem. Well, I have the answer. Wait, you do? Yeah, I've actually had the answer the whole time, but you never told us, and it was never established that you could do this or had the answer in the first place. I know, but I have it. But yeah, that's just my criticisms. Maybe they're warranted, maybe they aren't, but it doesn't take away from what I said earlier about how it's still a very enjoyable series and likable as well. And I had a good time with it overall. But now let me just go over all of the arcs and give my quick thoughts on them. So the Agent of Shinigami arc, which is like the first 70 chapters of the series, I'm really surprised by how much I enjoyed this because it's so much different than what the rest of the series is going to become. You like follow Ichigo and his friends for the most part, and it's very kind of slice of lifey, which I'm typically not really into, but I really enjoyed the world building that Kubo puts forth in these first 70 chapters, and it wasn't a slog to get through. Like, I just really enjoyed it for some reason, and the dynamics and everything, although all of this stuff is kind of just pushed to the side for the rest of the series after this, it still was likable. Then we have the Soul Society arc, and this is, you know, probably the best arc of the series, more or less. I mean, it doesn't like get worse after this, I would say, but this is probably the strongest because it has a strong beginning, strong middle, and a very strong ending. And I think the ending is so strong because Kubo had this mapped out for sure. And it also didn't need to have a big ultimate conclusion where the villain was ultimately defeated. And I think that's why it is so strong, because that's where Kubo seems to have a big weakness. Then we have the Arrancar arc. And for the most part, this is enjoyable. There are high and lows in it for sure. Some of the best moments in the series are definitely in this arc, but some of the most lackluster are in it as well. And I think Aizen is a very cool villain, but he's surprisingly shallow. Like, we hardly really ever get insight into him and why he's really doing what he's doing, other than he's just like a sociopathic prodigy that doesn't like the way that things are run, and he doesn't like the Soul King for some reason. Then we have the Lost Agent arc, and this is kind of just like a bridge arc taking us to the ending, if anything, and it was fine, but it just feels like it was all for naught, because like the Gotai 13 just come in at the end and just give him back his powers anyway. I do like the Fullbringers, and they had pretty interesting abilities, especially Tsukishima, but overall the arc was fine. I don't think it's as bad as people made it out to be. And then we have the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, and I enjoyed this. I thought it was pretty good, but considering how long it is, not as much happens as you think it would. Like, a lot of stuff isn't explained, and you're ultimately going to be left feeling unfulfilled, especially by the end. Like, Yuabak, like, what is he? Like, he's the son of the Soul King, but like, what does that mean? Who is the Soul King? Never find that out. What happens with most of the stuff after the resolution of the series? Never find that out. What is Ichigo's Bankai ability? Never find that out. And then you might say, well, you gotta read You Can't Fear Your Own World novel. That explains everything. And it's like, I'm not reading that, okay? I'm not reading a novel after the fact when it could have just been put on the page, especially when it could have just been made into a manga by someone else. Like, Kubo can just write it and then somebody else can just animate it. But overall, the ending was fine. I don't think it's as egregious as everyone else made it to be. It's just underwhelming. Yeah, that's my thoughts on the series. And yeah, like I said, I overall really enjoyed it, and I think you should read it as well too. It's fun and it's easy to get through. Let's talk about Kaiju number 8, because this is the next series that I'm going to be covering on the channel, and it's certainly worthy of that because it's great. It's also like in a collection of all of the series that I'm really enjoying right now. It's like equal parts One Punch Man, My Hero Academia, Attack on Titan, with little sprinkles of the other popular iconic battle mangas in there. But that being said, it still very much has an identity of its own. And not only that, it's picking up a lot of traction week by week because it is consistently in the top 10 hottest series on Manga Plus, with some weeks it even getting more views than some of the big 6 series do. So in this video, let me explain the overall series to you, but more so give you incentive to want to read it yourself, because as of this recording, it's only up to chapter 57. So at this point, it's a pretty easy catch up. And also, I'm going to be going into some spoiler stuff, but not too much. I'm not going to be outright spoiling like the huge events that happen in this series, but I am going to be talking about stuff that happens in like later chapters, just so I could better establish a foundation for things. But anyway, the series takes place in Japan, no surprise, and it's the nation with the highest monster emergence rates in the world. Also, no surprise there, but these monsters are referred to as kaiju, and I know that we associate kaiju with big giant monsters like Godzilla, but in this series, kaiju is more of like a general term for monsters. I guess it could also mean like strange creature or something. And don't get me wrong, there are many big monsters in this series, but they're not all that size. They actually come in various sizes and various classifications. And of course, there is a power level system to them as well, known as a fortitude number. And as far as I know, it ranges from like 1 to 10. We haven't seen a 10 yet. The highest it's gone so far, I think, is 9.8. But as I was saying about the various sizes of these kaiju, some are small, some are like medium, and then some are like really big. And the smaller ones are usually referred to as yoju. These like accompany the bigger or the stronger kaiju. They're usually under fortitude like 6, but sometimes they can be fortitude 6. And the kaiju who are usually above fortitude 6 are referred to as honju. But then if we go even higher than that, we come to the dai kaiju. These are like the strongest kaijus, I guess. They're usually starting at like fortitude 8 and then above that. Whenever we see a kaiju referred to as dai kaiju in the series, it means things are getting serious. Now, among all of the kaiju, the most elite of the elite are given numbers. Hence the title of the series, Kaiju number 8. That is our protagonist, who we'll get to. But outside of him, so far we've been introduced to at least 6 numbered kaiju. And of course, we can't have monsters if we don't have the humans who kill the monsters. And that's where we come to the protagonists, which are known as the Defense Force. And they operate like a typical battle manga defense force would. We have various units, and these units have captains and vice captains and lower ranks within them, and then the higher ranks that go all the way to the top with the general director. But let's talk about the MC of this series by the name of Kafka Hibino. So Kafka, unlike many shonen MCs, is 32 years old. And in the beginning of the series, we see that he's kind of like an underachiever, working as a part of the kaiju cleanup crew. Think about it as like crime scene cleanup, except they come in and clean the kaijus up after the Defense Corps, take care of them. Also, they dissect them and take the good parts to give to the Defense Corps, who will later use the important pieces of the kaiju and engineer it into new gear. This is actually a really cool element of the series, because like the main weapon of these Defense Corps members are these suits that they wear that have been engineered from like the muscle fibers of the kaiju, essentially making them all superhumans. But of course, not everybody is created equal. The more talent or genetic potential that an individual has can bring out more potential of the suit. So just like we've established with the kaijus, how they have like fortitude numbering that goes from 1 to 10, the Defense Corps members' power is predicated on the percentage of the suit that they can bring out. So the lowest, as we'll see, which is Kafka, once he eventually gets his suit, is like 1% unlocked potential. And then later on, we'll see that like the strongest can unlock 98% potential of their suit. But anyway, when Kafka was a child, he had a friend named Mina Ashiro. Yep, that's right. One letter off of the My Hero Academia character, Mina Ashido. Now, is that intentional? I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is. But anyway, they are united by kaijus basically destroying everything that they love, and they made a vow that they would both become like super powerful captains in the future and eventually take down the kaiju threats. And that brings us to Kafka's MC goal. No, it's not becoming the Hokage or the Pirate King. It is just simply one day being able to stand by Mina Ashiro's side and taking down the kaijus together. But that brings us back to Kafka being a 32-year-old underachiever working as a kaiju cleaner, because on the other side of the coin, Mina has fulfilled her duty. She has become the super powerful captain. Anyway, one day, an 18-year-old kid named Reino joins the cleanup crew as well. And this is kind of the catalyst to make Kafka realize that, hey, you know what? It's time for me to fulfill my potential, because Reino also wants to join the Defense Corps one day, and he's kind of just joining the cleanup crew to get more knowledge on kaiju biology, since that is going to be an aspect of being recruited into the Defense Corps. So eventually, coincidentally, and conveniently, a kaiju shows up and attacks both Kafka and Reino. And as you guessed it, Kafka, being the MC of course, sacrifices himself to save Reino from this kaiju. This is like the big bonding moment between the MC and his sidekick slash pseudo rival, but in a double twist, Kafka also winds up needing to be saved, and this is where Reino comes back and tries to save him. So we have a double selfless sacrifice here, which ultimately ends with Mina Ashiro coming in and just saving them both anyway. Just further establishing that, like, hey, you know, you're so far away from me. Let me just give you some more motivation to come up and be by my side one day. So later on, after they're in the hospital, out of nowhere, this kaiju parasite thing finds Kafka, which implies that it's been looking for him, and goes inside of his mouth, and he suddenly becomes the kaiju. And this is no ordinary kaiju. He's actually one of the strongest to ever exist, I guess, because it's revealed that his fortitude number is 9.8. The highest that we've seen registered in the series so far. That being said, he goes on to eventually being recognized as the title of the series, Kaiju number 8. But anyway, going further into the series, Kafka and Reino eventually make it into the Defense Corps, at the ground level of course. And this is where we start getting introduced to the other characters in the series who are also a part of the Defense Corps, such as Hoshina, who is the 3rd Division Vice Captain, right under Mina Ashiro. Hoshina is like the super fast swords guy. He also kind of reminds me of Ichimaru Gin from Bleach, but he's not a bad guy the way that he is, although at first it kind of seems like he's going to be a foil to Kafka. But we quickly come to learn that Hoshina is actually a really good guy, and you kind of just have to get past his guard at first, which seems to be devious, but like I said, he's actually pretty cool. But that brings me to one of the other main protagonists of the series that we meet in the Defense Corps, and that is Kikoru Shinomiya. She's like the Tatsumaki type character of this series, but also like the token prodigy. She's much further along than the other cadets in the Defense Corps, but a large part of this is because she's the daughter of like the GOAT Defense Corps member, who is currently the Director General, known as Isao Shinomiya. And like I said, he is the GOAT, but like not currently the strongest. He's kind of like pseudo-retired, but still super respected and formidable powerhouse in his own right. Kikoru is also established as being a love interest of Kafka, and yes, there is a large age gap between them, but this is Japan and it is battle manga. Now, I'm not saying that they're destined to wind up together, because I don't think they are. I mean, it's more so established that Kafka wants Mina Ashiro more so than just being by her side, I guess. That's another story for another time. But anyway, enough of the protagonists. Let's get to the antagonists, and that's Kaiju number 9. This guy shows up after their first training exercise, and he establishes right away that he is beyond powerful. Not as strong as Kafka in Kaiju number 8 form at first, but this was just established in the beginning of the series. But so far, Kaiju number 9 is like the string puller. He has like the ability to control the other Kaiju, but also create them and straight up bring them back from the dead. I wish I could tell you more about this guy and how the Kaijus work, but to be honest, we only really know so much. Even currently in the series, we're kind of just starting to scratch the surface with Kaiju number 9. But yeah, that's pretty much Kaiju number elaborate, and there's so much that I didn't talk about in this video that I hope you could just find out for yourself by actually reading it. So I've read all 49 chapters of Record of Ragnarok. This series is still ongoing, by the way, and I want to talk about it in this video. I'm not going to be talking about the anime, which just adapts the first part of this series anyway, because that's a whole other can of worms. So in case you're unfamiliar with this series, let me give you a brief synopsis on it. So every 1,000 years, the gods' council assembles to decide the fate of humanity. After 7 million years of human history, the gods come to the decision that humans are irredeemable and must go extinct. However, the Valkyrie Brunhilde proposes to give humanity one last chance to prove their worth, and the gods agree to hold the Battle of Ragnarok, a tournament with 13 notable humans from across history against 13 of the most powerful gods, engaging in duels to the death. Humanity will be spared if their side achieves 7 victories in the competition. To even the odds, each human is granted the assistance of a Valkyrie who transforms into a powerful weapon tailored for their user's combat style called Voland, at the risk of losing their life if the user is killed. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And if you're a little confused by that, it's understandable, because this series kind of throws you into the deep end of its world and just kind of expects you to swim. And what I mean by that is that this series is kind of unconventional and pretty original, actually. I mean, it's not reinventing the wheel or anything. This series is essentially just one really long battle manga tournament arc, but the way that it goes about it is really intriguing and, for a lack of a better word, kind of original. Now, don't expect a lot to be explained in this series, because it throws a lot at you and moves at a pretty good pace, but, you know, like, establishes so much lore and it introduces you to so many characters at the same time. And most of these characters are just adaptations of existing characters within multiple different mythologies and lores and religions. Like what I was talking about with the synopsis, the gods' council. Like, these gods are, you know, the gods that already exist within, like, mythology and religion and all that stuff. And from multiple different cultures, like, you know, the Greek gods, there's Asian gods, and so on and so forth. And the same thing goes for the humans. Some of them existed, I guess, and then some of them are kind of just urban legends or just myths or whatever. For example, like Lu Bu, who you may be familiar with, Adam from, like, the story of Adam and Eve, and even Jack the Ripper is in this series. Now, going back to what I was saying about don't expect everything to be explained, and that's because, like, you know, you're going to be seeing gods fighting humans, and somehow the humans are able to be competitive against the gods. And at first, these gods are established to be like what you'd expect a god to be, pretty much unbeatable, especially compared to that of a human. And words get thrown around in this series like omnipotent and omniscient, and it's better if you just don't take them literally. And of course, because these characters, both gods and humans, are just adaptations of existing lore, the authors kind of just took those ideas and gave them battle manga makeovers. Another interesting, and I'll say different thing about this series is that there's not like a real concrete MC, I would say. I mean, if you had to pick like who the MC of this series would be, I mean, obviously it would be Brunhilde, but it's not like a conventional MC as to where like you're following their journey, like what you typically do with a series. You're more so just kind of vicariously experiencing this tournament through Brunhilde. Because like what we talked about in the synopsis, she's like the one who is trying to save humanity here. She's the one who proposes Ragnarok. But outside of that, she never really fights or anything like that. At least not yet. I'm sure she will eventually. But aside from following her, the story tells itself through the fights. Because as these fights go on, you're following the spectators, whether it be like the humans that relate to the humans in the match, and then there's the gods that either relate to the gods within the match, or just the established god characters that we follow from start to finish, who are always going to be like the commentators, as well as like expositional mouthpieces. And we even get like slow character arcs on these commentators as the series goes on, which is like another fun little aspect to this series. For example, like Hermes and Ares, like you kind of start off being ambivalent towards them, but as the series progresses, I
personally came to really like these characters. And all they really do is kind of just commentate and relate to things. They never really like fight or anything. Now, as for the fights themselves, they're very formulaic and it kind of gets repetitive at a point, but at the same time, it kind of keeps itself fresh because every fight is different. And what I mean by formulaic is that you'll have the god who is obviously going to be the favorite, then you'll have the underdog human, then the human will reveal what their Voland is when one of the Valkyries, like one of Brunhilde's sisters, transforms into the weapon that the human uses, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to hurt the gods. And then the fight begins, and it's going to last anywhere from, like, I don't know, 6 to 12 chapters, maybe something like that. And through the fights, we get the exposition on these characters as well as their backstories and multiple flashbacks. These characters are being fleshed out and also having their own character arcs mid-fight. And this is an aspect of the series that I've come to really enjoy. And as for the fights themselves, like the choreography and the attacks and all that stuff, it's pretty cool. And I like that they don't go too absurd with the power scale. I mean, considering that these are gods and some of them are referred to being like omnipotent, you'd probably think like, oh, they could just do whatever they want, or they could like blow up universes or galaxies or whatever, but no, it's not like that. It's actually kind of grounded. Just for me personally, I don't like when battle manga gets too powerful. So I appreciate the balance that is struck in this series. And since we're talking about the fights and the choreography and all that stuff, we have to talk about the art. The art is very, very good in this series. I would say it's actually one of the highlights for sure. And it actually gets better as the series goes on. So yeah, that's pretty much my review of the series, and I'm enjoying it so far. And going forward, I would like to cover it on my channel. I mean, it's just like a monthly release, so you know, that's not too bad. So overall, I'm gonna give this an 8 out of 10. I think this is a pretty strong series, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it plays out from this point on. So at this point, I want to go into spoilers for the series, so if you don't want to know what's going to happen, check out now. To finish off this video, I just want to give my personal ranking on the fights that have happened. So far, there are 6 fights, and the latest one hasn't concluded yet, but I'm going to put that at number 6, which is Buddha versus Zero Fuku. This isn't bad, but it's just not as compelling as the other fights, and it's kind of annoying at times, mainly because Zero Fuku, I'm not really too much into this character, although I do like their backstory. Number 5 is Lubu versus Thor. This is the first fight, so we're not really too emotionally invested into it yet, but it was fine, and it certainly had its moments and really establishes what the series is going to be like. Number 4 is Raiden versus Shiva. I really like this fight because, you know, it's just pure battle manga blood and guts, and it's also the second fight that feels like a god versus god fight. Because let's be real here, Raiden could be a god in this series. Number 3 is Sasaki versus Poseidon. I mean, how can you not like this fight? Sasaki is just so likable, and him getting the first win for humanity is just... Number 2, this might be a little controversial, but Heracles versus Jack the Ripper. This is an incredible fight, and the writing is just so well done. And I love the dynamic because you're supposed to be rooting for humanity, but how can you root for someone as like evil and disgusting as Jack the Ripper? And at the same time, you have the good guy for the gods, Heracles, but he's also with the gods against humanity. And then with Jack eventually winning, just cemented this fight as like a 9.5 to me. Like, this is just so well done. And then number 1, Adam versus Zeus. This is just a really, really well done, cool, straight up battle manga fight. Another 9.5 from me for this one.
So I finally understand why Demon Slayer is so incredibly popular, at least in Japan. Not so sure about the Western side of things, but it smashes all kind of records in both manga and recently with the movie. And I was always kind of curious as to why that was. Like, is it like some kind of groundbreaking series that's like reinventing the wheel, or is it something really new and inventive? And the answer is no. It's pretty standard, like cookie cutter battle manga shonen through and through, but it's just super solid and clean. Like, it just does everything right. Like, I just really enjoyed watching this season. It was easy. I was looking forward to every episode, even from the beginning straight up until the end. And going back to how I was saying that it doesn't really reinvent the wheel or anything, it just sticks to the fundamentals. And it's just, I guess, kind of refreshing to see something just so well made and clean the way that Demon Slayer is. Like, the story just makes sense. It's not complex, but it's also not shallow or watered down or dumbed down or anything like that. Information isn't necessarily spoon-fed to you, but it's easily accessible, and they don't need to repeat themselves multiple times to get the point across about how things work, because there's not really a lot going on here. Like I said, it's pretty standard. It's like, here's the lore of the world. There's demons that exist. It's not really that well known. And then there's the demon slayers who killed the demons. It's pretty straightforward. But with that being said, not every single thing is explained yet, such as the demons and Muzan and all of that stuff, and we'll get to him, but I'm sure it eventually will be. And let me also point it out there that this series has concluded, unfortunately, in the manga. The anime goes to 26 episodes, which comprises like the first 51 or 52 chapters of the series, and there's only 205 chapters within the series. So it's also very concise as well and compact. Like, the creator of this series had a straightforward vision and stuck to it. So let's get into the characters, I guess. So Tanjiro is the MC of this series, and he's just straightforward, you know, shonen battle manga MC. He's one of the most altruistic MCs I remember seeing in one of these series. Like, there's little to no irony to him. He never really does anything that would be considered wrong. He's always on the right side of things. And I guess that's one of the key roles in making an extremely likable character, I suppose. He's not polarizing at all. And that could also be detrimental, I suppose, to a character like this, but it just works out. And you always kind of just still wind up rooting for him, despite his character arcs always being somewhat predictable, I guess. Another thing that I like about his character is that he doesn't have too much, I'll say, plot intervention on his side. He really does feel like he's earned everything that he has, like, especially in combat and stuff like that. Like, there's not a lot of, like, friendship and Deus Ex moments, and there are a little bit of those, and we'll get to that. Like, whenever he wins a fight or something like that, it just feels earned and it makes sense. You don't really have to suspend your disbelief, I guess, too much with the outcomes, because it's like, oh, he's clearly trained this much. We see him do it plenty of times within this series, so it makes sense with some of these outcomes, and you get to see how his mental progress works, and the stakes are never really too low as to where you're like, oh, well, how's he gonna pull this one out? It's also not like, you know, the other standard fights where he's beaten into a pulp until he's on the verge of death, and then, I don't know, whatever, Deus Ex or friendship comes into play, and then he wins. I mean, that does happen once, and even then, it's really not that egregious. I would say this series almost somewhat earns that moment, considering it doesn't tap into that really too much, or really at all. And then we have his sister, Nezuko, and she's fine. It's a little weird how the fandom is obsessed with her. I mean, also, if you look at Google Trends of like waifus, she like skyrockets to the top. I think she's a pretty cool sidekick to Tanjiro. She has her own little developments that she has here and there. And she also brings like an interesting dynamic to the series. But another thing that I did notice, of course, is that when she's not needed for the story, she kind of is just put off to the side and she falls asleep, which is convenient, but it's fine because, you know, you can't always account for every single character in this series. Sometimes you need to focus on Tanjiro, and her ultimate arc and whatever her story is isn't really that important. She's kind of just there for Tanjiro to have purpose and for also the stakes to kind of always be at a certain level. And then we have Zenitsu. He's like the token comedic friend slash partner who is also like taking up the pervy character role as well. I'm not gonna front here, Zenitsu's pretty annoying, and especially because like he's never really not like the annoying, funny, pervy dude. Like, he's always at like a 10 with that stuff. And he does have moments where he is redeemed and, you know, is serious somewhat, but even that hasn't really been explored too much. I mean, I get it, like when he falls asleep, then he becomes serious or whatnot. He's like subconsciously super powerful. And I'm sure later on in the series, he has all the arcs and all the developments and he overcomes that. But in season 1, he is, I would say, more annoying than likable. I don't hate his character or anything like that. I just wish they pulled it a little back with him. He's a little too much. And then we have Inosuke. Inosuke is like the crazy wild card friend partner that kind of balances out the trio here. I think that he's a lot of fun and I like what he brings to the series. He, unlike Zenitsu, is pulled back sometimes, and he's not always at a 10, even though he's at like a 15 a lot of the times.
he does have a lot of redeeming qualities to him, and his vague backstory does make him understandable for the way that he is. And I like Inosuke, and I have a feeling that maybe he's one of the fan favorites aside from Nezuko, but she's mainly just favored because she's kawaii. I also like the element of the Hashira. Like I said, very standard. You know, you're gonna have like the elite members of whatever's going on in a battle manga or shonen, and that's the Hashira of this series. They're like the top demon slayers, and they're all pretty cool, all individual, reminiscent of like the Gotai 13 from Bleach, or you know, you can compare them to so many other things, but I like the way that they're done. They all kind of bring their own little element to the series. And then going over to the villain side of things, I really like Muzan. He's like the main villain of the series, and I thought his introduction was awesome. One of the best villain introductions I've seen in one of these series. Like, that was definitely one of the most hyped I've been in this show. Like, when we finally get to see him and the way that it plays out with the twists and everything, I thought it was really cool. And of course, if the good guys have the elite squad, then the bad guys have the elite squad as well, and that's the 12 Kazuki, which are like the 12 strongest demons under Muzan, and they're all pretty interesting as well. We have yet to see the super powerful members. We've only seen like the lower ranking guys, and that's mainly in the last episode. But aside from that, this series is also way more violent than I thought it was going to be. Like, it's exceptionally violent, which is pretty cool. I'm not complaining, but you'd expect that a clean series like this would probably tone it back, especially how popular it is, but maybe that adds into why it is so well received. But overall, this was fantastic. Really enjoyed it. Looking forward to more. Hope I can watch the movie whenever that comes out. I'm feeling a light to decent 9 on this series for sure. Transition. If you liked the video, guys, please give it a like. Please subscribe. I'm trying to reach 100K by the end of the year. Let me know what you think about Demon Slayer in the comments. I also have Patreon, Twitch. I got stuff. Check them out. Have a great day. See you in the next one.